one of the first things you need to know about being an effective, engaged citizen is you have to be informed. And if you want to change the status quo, if you perceive there's a problem that's not being fixed, that's usually because that problem that you perceive is something that somebody else wants it to be that way because they're advantaged by it. And so you've got to figure out, all right, who are the players? What are the stakes? What is the law behind it? What is your role as a citizen? Where can you get into the process and provide some of your own input and opinions? Where can you apply leverage to bring change?
I looked at two historical events to mark the change in Arizona politics to becoming, since the 1960s, known as a deep red state. Now things are in play right now as we speak in 2021. But for a good part of the latter half of the 20th century, you have Barry Goldwater, who was a longtime senator from Arizona, who was also considered to be the father of the modern conservative movement. And even though he lost in his bid for the presidency against Lyndon Johnson in 1964, he nonetheless started kind of the modern conservative movement. And so that's one event that began to change Arizona politics. The other event that I would say that also occurred in the same time, the 1960s, was the creation of retirement communities in Arizona. And what that meant is that the retirement communities in Arizona, starting in 1960, Sun City, appealed to a lot of people from the Midwest, a lot of voters from the Midwest who come from more conservative parts of the country. And coming out to Arizona, they brought their politics with them, of course, which also helped begin to shift the state more towards red politics, if you will, or towards a Republican identity.
You know, every state in the United States has its own political culture. This state, the state of Arizona, has a particular political legacy that stems from the fact that it developed as a state quite late in the history of the United States. Arizona didn't even become a state until 1912. So there's a long period of time in which the culture of the state was a place that's outside the centers of power, a place that's on the margins, a frontier, so to speak. And that psychology of being outside the centers of power, on the margins, on a frontier, still imbues the state. And some of the characteristics of a frontier mentality are, a lot of people think that it's important to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. We don't need any government in here funding things or telling us what to do or managing or doing planning. Just let us do our own thing. So you have to watch for that. It's very deeply embedded in Arizona culture. And because of that, it's really hard to come up with solutions that involve government action. In the American West, in the frontier regions, there was a lot of boom and bust economies. You'd have a corporation come in, open up a mine, you'd have a whole bunch of people come in, everybody'd have jobs, there'd be a lot of money floating around. 5 years, 10 years, 20 years later, the minerals are gone, company leaves with all of their profits, everybody else gets left behind with a devastated landscape and no jobs. You use nature to create, wealth and products. And if you don't use nature responsibly and sustainably, you have a boom and bust economy. So Arizona's history has been a history of embracing libertarianism and fighting against regulation and building economies based on the exploitation of natural resources, which leads to booms and busts.
So the history of voting in Arizona is a very interesting history. In many ways, before the Voting Rights Act of 1965, Arizona looked very similar to the American South in terms of the practices that were in place by county registrars to disfranchise people. And so the kinds of tactics that they had in place were, again, typical of many regions that you would find in the South. You had to pay a poll tax. So in other words, if you wanted to vote, you had to pay a tax. There were grandfather clauses in place that if your grandfather wasn't a citizen of the United States, you couldn't vote. Well, that would have a tremendous impact on Latino immigrants, but also American Indians. Certainly right now there's a lot of energy and activism on the part of many state legislators to suppress voting because of the belief, which again is unfounded, but the belief that there are unregistered voters who are voting, there are illegal immigrants who are voting, there is double voting, all these kinds of things. This is the belief that is there. Again, of all the studies that have looked into this, all the investigations, there's just nothing there. But nonetheless, that has inspired a number of state legislatures to enact more restrictive voting policy. So in Arizona, for example, the governor just signed a law that removed people from the mail-in voting ballot if they had not voted in the previous 2 election cycles. So that's a way of removing them from that. Now, it doesn't necessarily prevent them from voting. They can still go to the polls and vote. So it is technically still there. Part of the problem, though, is when you have people who are far from voting areas. If you have precincts that don't provide enough poll places for people to get to, and within a reasonable amount of time, then that becomes a problem. That's why mail-in votes become very, very significant, particularly in Arizona, where we have some very large rural counties. And again, going back to the native vote, many of our native communities live in counties that are very far-flung, and voting by mail is very, very important. Otherwise, you're traveling over ungraded roads. Depending on what the weather is like, either it's passable or not, it becomes a much more complicated issue when you deny people the right to vote by mail. I would say there are a couple of things that define Arizona politics right now. Immigration probably being one of the key issues, given that we're a border state. And so, interestingly, so even though we're talking about immigration, it's not build the wall kind of immigration. What most Arizonans want is a reasoned immigration policy. They want the policies that we have now, unified, fixed, if you will, pathways to citizenship, recognizing the unique situation that Dreamers are in right now, for example, and being able to accommodate them. People want to see the immigration policy fixed in a way that's fair. What most Arizonans want is they want accessible health care. They want more education in the state. They want more state support for education. Now that's different than the things that people talk about in the legislature of Arizona. That's a very different issue. Now, as we speak in 2021, there is kind of a forensic analysis going on about why Arizona shifted in the last presidential election to support now President Biden as opposed to then President Trump, which was the prediction, by the way. From all data that we have, that's not what most Arizonans care about. That's what the Republican Party in Arizona cares about, and it's certainly what Republican legislators care about. So as we speak, there's a recount going on, even though there were 3 previous official recounts that went on that all certified the election as fair. But nonetheless, we have another one underway. How that will result is anyone's guess. But again, in terms of what's occupying the political attention of our legislators is really trying to determine how Arizona lost Donald Trump. Most Arizonans, I would argue, don't care about that. That is not front and center. And that's a very complicated picture as well. Why do we have state representatives who focus in on the kinds of issues that most Arizonans are not asking for?
And that division is problematic because a lot of problem solving happens at the state level. Let me step back for just a second. If you want to engage in solving problems, you got to find out where's the problem stemming from and where might the solution come from. So a lot of problems are local, and that's local governance is where you want to pay attention. So your city council or your mayor, or your county board of supervisors at the county level. If the problem is broader, like statewide, then you're going to have to look for action at the state legislative level or in state agencies like the Arizona Game and Fish Department manages our fish and wildlife in the state of Arizona. Maybe the problem requires federal action. If you want to put your thumb on the scale of getting, say, a raise in the minimum wage, you might want to work at the federal level right now because the Democrats are in charge, and one of their platforms was to raise the minimum wage to $15. At the state level in Arizona, they want to keep the minimum wage as low as possible because they think that's good for business. And if if Arizona is perceived as a state that's good for business, they think more entrepreneurs and more business people will move into the state and invest in jobs here. Well, if the jobs are paying $8 an hour, what good is that, in my opinion? So maybe you want to work on increasing the minimum wage. Well, I would say work at the city level, because some cities can pass regulations that say any company that gets a contract to do business for the city has to pay a certain wage level, and the city itself can raise its wages for the people that it employs. You're probably not going to make any progress at the Arizona state level on that, but at the federal level and the local level, yes. So again, figure out what you care about, where the leverage is, and then get to know the agencies and the laws that structure why things are the way they are, so that you can figure out how to make some change. In closing, I think I would like to make a couple of recommendations for my favorite issues that I think need a lot more attention here in the state in the coming decade or two. Urban growth. But we have serious problems with water supply that we're not dealing with, and serious problems with air pollution in our urban areas. And we need to grow a little bit slower and a lot smarter than we've been growing. So if you're a city person, look at growth management and water resources. Those are the two key things that are going to define Arizona's urban future for the next generation or two. Natural resource management sustainability in the face of climate change is another big issue. So climate change is drying up our rivers, heating up our deserts, drying out our forests, and leading to catastrophic large fires. It affects every single ecosystem from desert to mountaintop, and that's going to be a very big deal, especially fire management over the next 30, for the foreseeable future. So I would look at that too.
For people who are concerned about what's going on in this country and what's been going on, I would offer this, is that democracy is only as strong as our commitment to uphold it, to make it work. We have to be involved. We cannot afford to sit back and hope that someone else will do the work. It is upon every one of our shoulders to speak to our representatives, to lobby them, to represent the issues that are near and dear to our heart. If we sit back and if we don't engage in politics, then other people and other agendas will take control. And that is not, I think, a desirable outcome. The best outcome is that we all participate. We're all engaged in this democratic conversation. And through dialogue and through listening, that we come to a better place of at least mutual understanding and finding reasonable solutions from our different positions. But it requires engagement. We have to be involved. Otherwise, democracy dies.